Well, hi, dear. How's things at your mom's? Good. Good. Me? Oh, nothing. Am I on eBay? Nope. I'm just, cleaning house. No, I learned my lesson after the rocket launcher. Yeah, no more expensive eBay purchases for this guy. Hey! Oh, sorry, I was, shouting at birds. The noise? Oh, that's a hamster. Yeah, Bob had to go on an emergency, fishing trip or something. And he asked me if I'd watch his hamster. It's a big hamster. Yeah, like 60 pounds, Rottweiler size. Whoa, whoa, whoa! What's that? Yeah, no, it talks. Yeah, no, I didn't know what it was that either. It's an Assyrian speaking hamster from Assyria. Listen, I gotta go, hon. He's chewing through the cage bars again. I'll call you back.
I paid for stealth delivery! Stealth!
I recently picked up a Worthpoint subscription. If you're a serious collector who wants to be careful about what you pay for vintage gear, Worthpoint is really handy and provides reams of historical data eBay for some reason refuses to. Recently, I used it to look up prices for the rare Ferguson Big Board to figure out what a reasonable offer for one would be that I bought. As I was looking, I got curious, what were the most expensive vintage computer purchases on eBay in 2023? And then I thought, I should make a video about this. So I did. Now, I will note I am sticking to full-blown computers here for my list. There are a few components that would have made this top 10 list, like this Voodoo prototype card which fetched a cool $15,000. Also, Worthpoint's classification system doesn't match eBay's. Vintage computers can fall under tools or uncategorized, so yeah. But I figure if I search for computer and then set the sorting on price to go from high to low, that'd probably do it, since there aren't very many brand new computers that get into the kind of high prices that vintage ones do. So I may have missed something if someone didn't put the word computer in their title or description or something like that, but yeah, I've done my best here. I'm also trying to stick to auctions only. I'm a bit wary of high buy it now prices as they are not always reflective of where the market is at, and sometimes are used to manipulate the market. You'll often see vintage gear pop up and quote-unquote sell for a high price, only for it to pop up again later. Anyway, let's kick things off, starting with the cheapest of the 10 most expensive items of 2023, and work our way to the most expensive. You know, there are expensive vintage computers where it's really obvious why they're expensive. Like an Atari Falcon or an Apple Lisa, but this I don't understand at all. Okay, yes, it's highly unusual, it's Apple, it's apparently ultra mega stupid uber rare, but still, what the f***? Now, as I poke fun at this thing, bear in mind, as an historian, I do appreciate Apple Powerbooks, especially the original Powerbook 100, which in some ways is actually kind of a Sony. The Powerbook arose during the Sculley era. Okay, settle down, put that chair down please. Thank you. Yeah, Sculley isn't a popular name in Apple circles. However, I've always taken a nuanced view of his stewardship. He was a necessary step in maturity for the company and helped stabilize Apple at a time when it was flailing about after a string of problematic products. Apple in the late 80s and early 90s found itself relying on the Apple II line for survival. About 2/3 of the cost of a $1,400 Apple IIe was pure profit, and that went directly into payroll and R&D. Sculley was a businessman first. He knew to survive, Apple had to innovate. Apple had attempted portability before with the 2C and 2C Plus. Next, Apple shrunk the Mac Plus into the Macintosh Portable. The Portable was no laptop though, it was huge and heavy and known to be persnickety at times. The new Powerbook line was designed to take aim at industry leaders Toshiba and Compaq, both of which had just released laptops weighing less than 8 pounds, which was a milestone considering how heavy laptops and portables had been before then. Today, the Powerbook 100 looks staid and also kind of bulky and very gray. But at the time of its debut in 1991, it was rather impressive. Apple had contracted Sony to shrink the Macintosh Portable down to this, and they succeeded spectacularly. Sporting a Motorola 68000 running at 15 MHz, 2 to 8 megs of RAM, and a 20 or 40 meg hard drive, the 5-pound Powerbook was truly a laptop and occupied the low end at around $2,500 brand new. Alongside the 100 were released more powerful models, including the 170, which had a faster 30 MHz CPU, larger hard drive options, active matrix screen, and an internal floppy disk, which made it a significantly better machine, albeit at a cost of $4,600. Personally, I'm so-so on the first PowerBooks. I respect them as the milestones that they are, but Apple's color choices back then kind of looked like they were devised by these guys.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy.
So much for you, Rainbow Bright. What is it?
Some kind of intervance.
I don't like it.
I like it. If they don't like it, I like it.
So what's this about a Japanese ladies PGA tournament special edition PowerBook 170? Yeah, say goodbye to gray, say hello to Rainbow Barf. This looks like something left in the care of a third grader with an acrylic paint set. They made the base blue, they made the hinges yellow, red battery doors and sliders, and green feet. Oh, and a white top, just because. But yeah, strangely, they took a pass on doing something flashy with the trackball and keyboard. Like, couldn't they have at least thrown some hot pink in here? Or did someone in design finally say, too much? Hey wait, what about internal improvements? No? I guess they didn't have a 30 MHz Motorola CPU in neon green. Yeah, look, I'm gonna be honest, I think this thing just looks tacky. I mean, true, they could have gone like full Hello Kitty Mafia with this, but still. Apart from colors and a Japanese keyboard, yep, this looks like just a regular old 170. I've no idea if Apple charged over and above the price of a regular old gray 170. I mean, they must have, right? Somebody had to pay for this. Man, I've never been so glad to be repulsed by an expensive vintage computer doodad. The color choices make me think VTech for kids. Yeah, of course I'd grab one in a heartbeat for cheap, but not for what they're selling for right now. So exactly how much will a JLPGA Powerbook 170 set you back? Well, consider first that Apple quote-unquote only made 500 of them. So naturally, this being Apple memorabilia, and despite the lack of anything special whatsoever hardware-wise, this particular unit sold for $8,500 US.
What?
Nope, that's not an aberration. Google around. This is what collectors expect to pay. Anyway, here's another thought. Pick up a regular gray 170 for a couple hundred, and grab yourself a paint set from Michaels and, have at her. Who'd know? I'll never forget the first time I encountered the Amiga at a computer store in the late 1980s. I was absolutely blown away by the graphics, especially since I was suffering along with 4-color CGA at the time. I believe this was the exact demonstration I saw at the computer store, and yeah, I just wouldn't shut up about buying an Amiga for the next 2 or 3 years. The 4000 was both the Amiga and Commodore's swan song. The 4000 introduced the advanced graphics architecture, and it poses a lot of interesting alternative history questions. I think AGA was supposed to save Commodore's bacon, but unfortunately that task was a bit too much to ask of the Amiga. Originally as introduced, the 4000 was kind of an ordinary looking desktop computer. Sporting a Motorola 68040 running at 25 MHz with anywhere from 2 to 8 MB of RAM, it could display 256 colors on screen at once out of a palette of 16.7 million at 800 by 600 resolution without any of Amiga's signature graphics tricks. And, via a special display mode called Ham 8, you could even have 262,000 colors on screen. It also had a handy built-in IDE controller which allowed the use of cheaper IDE drives. Of course, it also cost about $3,700 US. I struggled to find any sort of authoritative sales figures for the 4000, but it seems like low tens of thousands would have been a reasonable estimate. Yeah, not very common to start with. And then we get to the 4000T in our auction here. The T signifies that this is a new tower-cased version of the machine, and these are super duper rare. I have no idea at all how many there are out there, but given the release date in 1994, just as Commodore's ship was about to founder, yeah, I don't think there'd be that many. That said, I don't recall seeing a 4000T get to $8,600 before.
This is a joke, right?
A more typical price for these is around 3 to 4K. I mean, it could be simply the usual price inflation, or it could be something like the Cyberstorm accelerator board that's installed. You Yeah, if anybody spots anything interesting that might be pumping up the value here in the pictures, let me know in the comments. It does look pretty slick though, doesn't it? Especially that smoke glass door in the front, which kind of reminds me of a Minicomputer. Anyway, yeah, that price, that's gonna be kind of on the future acquisition list, like way in the future. Minicomputers are kind of a niche type thing. Despite that, Minicomputers almost always fetch huge dollars at auctions. For years, I've kind of imagined Minicomputer collectors as being the type of folks that live in fly-in communities where you have a hangar for a garage, and the HOA allows you one Saturn V rocket in your yard in lieu of a hot tub. I'm kidding. But yeah, these guys do seem to be willing to part with huge amounts of money, not to mention physical real estate, for this obsolete iron, as this DEC PDP-11/45 Minicomputer demonstrates. Digital Equipment Corporation is a legendary company whose roots date back to the 1940s. The Programmable Data Processor, or PDP-1, became their first entry into offering computers for business use. They sold over 50 of these US $120,000 machines. 50. Big numbers back then though. That's $8 million in today's money, folks, each. The success of the PDP-1 assured the company's future, and they developed a range of different machines, including the legendary PDP-8. The PDP-11 in many ways is a bridge between eras. Prior to its arrival, computing had been the preserve of a privileged few, companies that could afford mainframes by companies like IBM, GE, or CDC. Programming was done in just a handful of languages by a small number of dedicated companies. Data entry was via punched cards. The PDP-11, however, democratized computing with its relatively low cost and versatility. Initial models weren't terribly impressive. The original 1120 only had 4 kilobytes of RAM and stored data on paper tape, and used a teletype Model 33 as a console, but future models found themselves doing things like pilot training systems, accounting, air traffic control, and even the controls for the Nike missile defense system. The PDP-11 series was in service for 2 decades, something that would be unheard of today. Nearly 600,000 machines were sold, making it one of the most popular mini-computers of all time. You can kind of see why some collectors are all over these. Add to the fact that there simply aren't many of them out there anymore. Most began to be dismantled and scrapped in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I bet there probably wasn't much of a secondary market for them. What can you do with a computer whose original value in today's dollars would be 6 figures now in the 2020s? Well, you can run your Christmas lighting, maybe operate the most expensive accounting system on your block, or maybe calculate trajectories for your vintage Nike missile. Of course, you'll pay $10,000 for the privilege, which is what this slightly disheveled looking unit appears to have sold for. Man, and you might have to pay that again in freight if you don't live close by. I mean, you can't beat the coolness factor, right? It's not like your neighbors are gonna have one of these. Look at that awesome looking 70s front panel. Yeah, man, I'd love to try entering data on those paddle switches. It looks so much more enjoyable than the Altair's dinky little bat switches. But yeah, 10 large is 10 large. This machine came with a rack, and it only weighs 300 pounds, kids. Take that, FedEx. Yeah, this kind of thing makes me really glad I drew a line for myself and said no to collecting anything except for microcomputers. Anything that requires my entire living room and chews up 2200 watts while in operation is not micro enough for me. They are really cool though. Well, after my last video, you probably can't be really surprised that the MIT's Altair 8800 is in the top 10 most expensive vintage computing purchases of 2023. Yep, remember how I said they can hit over $6,000? Yeah, apparently they can go much higher. Yeah, there's just a whole pile of stuff with this one, including a polymorphic video terminal interface board, a keyboard, disk drives, and some extra RAM boards. Unfortunately, the pictures are quite small here, but I can see the original owner of this machine got fed up with the whole front panel switches and lights paradigm, can't say I blame them, and was one of the many owners who took the chance to upgrade their Altair 8800 into a much more practical computer. Note that this Altair is sporting the Sense switch line that is straight across rather than angled downwards, which was an earlier dress panel design. This is definitely a Rev Zero machine according to the seller, and with serial number 221559K, which is about halfway to where mine was produced. It looks like the owner installed some kind of proto board thing on the right here, and yeah, it's right beside 2 MIT's 4-slot backplanes. The power supply is kind of hard to see in these tiny photos, but I can definitely make out the line of capacitors that are part of the original PSU. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised that the original power supply is able to power all this stuff. Yeah, so even though this is modified, the stock componentry is still there. Having what appears to be two 5¼ Shugart SA400 floppies and a keyboard no doubt helps the price some. And what was the final price on this fine-looking Altair? Oh, just a little over $10,000. Yeah, much as I'd love to have a vintage original, seeing prices like this makes me want to hug my cheapo Altair a little more. By the way, check out this really neat crocheted Altair 8800 that my daughter made. Pretty cool, huh? And way more affordable. Next up, we have a computer here that, dating from 1996, kind of skirts the edge of what is considered vintage. I know the classification of things as vintage or not is kind of subjective and ever-changing, and is actually argued about all the time in various online forums. It's hard to believe, but 1996 was nearly 30 years ago, and while personally I don't consider the 1990s to be vintage territory, other people do, and it's really all a matter of perspective. And anyway, the B-Box is certainly a worthy exception to my own vintage rule. The B-Box was a product of B Inc., which was started by Apple's former Director of European Operations, Jean-Louis Gasset. After ascending to the heights of Apple management, Gasset was forced out by then CEO John Sculley. Okay, put the chairs down. Thank you. For underperformance. He responded by starting a new ground-up computer company. B Inc. would produce both an OS, called BOS, and a computer to demonstrate its capabilities, the B-Box. Originally developed on hardware running AT&T's Hobbit microprocessor, BOS was adapted to run on PowerPC-based systems with the hope of attracting a buyout offer from Apple, whose own macOS was increasingly obsolete and whose own replacement OS, the Copeland project, had gone horribly awry. BOS was billed as a sort of multimedia powerhouse, an OS for the internet-enabled future. To showcase the potential of their OS, B designed their own PowerPC-based computer, the B-Box. This machine looked basically like a PC clone, but inside it was a little different. Sporting either dual 66 MHz or 133 MHz PowerPC processors, the B-Box also featured a huge array of ports on the back, everything from MIDI ports to RCA connectors, PS2 mouse port, 4 serial ports, along with something called GeekPort, which was provided for experimental electronic development. Probably the most noticeable thing about the B-Box, though, are the so-called blinking lights on the front, which indicate CPU activity. The dual 66 MHz model debuted at a little over $1,500, and the dual 133 at just over $3,000. I could do a whole video on BOS, but we don't have time for that here. Anyway, initially Gasset's hopes of selling to Apple looked to be coming to fruition. Apple realized that their own Copeland project was basically unrecoverable, so they set up a committee to buy B Inc. and build a new macOS around BOS. However, the two sides found themselves at loggerheads on price. Gasset held out for more money than Apple was willing to spend, and in a fateful decision, Apple's board of directors eventually decided to buy Steve Jobs' next step instead. BOS would carry on for a few years, but ultimately petered out sometime around 2002. At one time, you could grab a B-Box for not very much money. Years ago, they were just remnants of another failed technology company, and honestly, they just looked like any other PC. I probably passed up about a half a dozen opportunities to own one. In recent years, however, the B-Box has enjoyed a renaissance, and collectors are starting to shell out some truly huge dollars for them. They routinely go for several $1,000s now. This particular model is the dual 133 MHz version, and someone shelled out $10,000 for the privilege of owning it.
Holy mackerel!
Well, I guess I'm just going to have to scratch this one off my collecting list. Yeah, this one does seem to be very clean, and it is a one-owner machine, which is always a plus with collectors like me. The seller really goes all in on the descriptives, referring to the BOS era as the golden age of computing. I'll leave you folks in the comments to debate that one. Well, here's another example of Apple absolutely dominating values for vintage computers. In vintage computing circles, you'll hear the term Apple II thrown around a lot. It's both a model of a computer and a whole line, the most plentiful of which is the IIe. From a collecting standpoint, the Apple II is quite affordable as long as you don't go for the super rare models. There's nothing a Rev Zero can do that a IIe can't for a sliver of the price. But this is collecting, and common sense is out the window when it comes to rare Apple IIs, especially the Rev Zero. I would argue the Rev Zero Apple II is Woz's magnum opus. He utilized nearly every gate out of nearly every IC on the board and taught a masterclass in creative engineering. The Rev Zero is the Apple II as Woz delivered it, complete with his own integer basic and even a big prototyping area, a nod to Apple's hobbyist roots. The Apple I gets more money and notice, but the two literally built and saved Apple. I consider myself crazy lucky to have acquired a Rev Zero myself before prices went crazy. I plan to do a full video on my Rev Zero, which is a couple thousand serial numbers above this one, so I won't dive too deeply into details. For now, all you need to know about the Rev Zero versus other Apple IIs is this. Purple text. Purple text. Oh, and that you'll need to sell your car to buy this one. The Rev Zero is the Apple II before it got all friendly-like. When you turn this sucker on, you've got a puzzle to figure out, first resetting into text mode, which lands you into a rather consumer-unfriendly system monitor, before you figure out hitting Control-B brings you to basic. None of that wimpy auto-start nonsense. This is pure computing. Out of a total production run of around 60,000 machines, only about 5,000 or 6,000 original Apple IIs were Rev Zeros, so you know what that means. It can be really difficult to find one of these with all of its original parts. OG Apple II users were mostly a practical bunch. If Apple wanted to replace that urethane case that they tried for a few hundred units that was melting on folks, most OG users didn't worry about future resale values or collectability. The same goes for replacing key components like the motherboard. The integer ROMs are a particular sticking point with collectors. A lot of original users upgraded to the more functional AppleSoft BASIC. Finding original integer ROMs is difficult to say the least. But this machine doesn't seem to have any of those issues. It looks to be fully stock, unmolested, and very clean. And if you're a lucky seller in possession of such a beast, you're about to come into $12,000.
Come again?
And that's not even the most expensive I've seen with these. The ultra-rare so-called ventless version of the Rev Zero, with that melting urethane issue I mentioned earlier, those can go for twice as much. It wasn't that long ago that these were going for just a few $1,000s, but now even the dark green slot Rev Zero, which is slightly less desirable than the light green slot, is going for close to $7,000, and that's like more than twice what I paid for mine just a few years back. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see these getting cheaper anytime soon. APF Electronics, so named as an acronym after the initials of its founders Al and Phil Friedman, started off as an importer of Japanese stereos, and from there they branched out into calculators. Electronic calculators were the electronic thing to be selling in the early 70s, at least until the manufacturers of their chips started coming up with their own models and competing directly against those that they were supplying the chips to. Like many electronics companies at the time, APF was always looking for new opportunities. In 1972, Atari released its first video game, Pong, which was quote-unquote inspired by similar games developed on the PDP-1 and the Magnavox Odyssey. Atari then brought the fun into living rooms across the country via its home Pong console. Success breeds imitation, and it wasn't long before dozens of Pong console clones were flooding the market. APF became interested in this new market when General Instrument, a maker of integrated circuits, released the AY3-8500. This IC was referred to as Pong on a chip, which significantly reduced the number of components required to build a Pong console. The AY3-8500 had 6 games on board, the obligatory tennis, or Pong of course, but also hockey or soccer, squash, 2 shooting games, something called Practice, and a 7th hidden game called Handicap. It was from this chip that APF developed their first game console, the APF TV Fun. APF would ultimately make over 400,000 TV Fun units and millions of dollars. APF's next project would be their most ambitious and also proved to be their undoing. In the late 1970s, the concept of convergence had taken hold with many electronics firms. Many game console makers were keen to have the word computer conspicuously present in their product lines. Model names like the Atari Video Computer System, the Bally Home Library Computer, all suggested that these consoles were potentially usable as computers, not just game consoles. I don't think anyone really succeeded here. Neither Atari nor Bally ever produced the anticipated upgrades for their systems. Intellivision was eventually sued by its customers for not providing the computer expansion unit it had promised fast enough. Coleco got its Atom out to consumers, but the high-speed cassette decks sometimes broke tapes, and powering on could wipe them and anything else nearby. APF, like the other electronics companies, thought they had the right idea. Dubbed the Imagination Machine, their device was also 2 machines in one, both a gaming console as well as a computer. APF did actually have some experience with computers, having released the enormous APF Picos 1 in 1978. This unique machine, which looked like a Sol 20 that had been stung by bees, offered a complete all-in-one unit with dual cassette decks. The system ran a variation of JOS, a programming language similar in some respects to BASIC. The Imagination Machine was developed by noted engineer Ed Smith. Ed was one of very few engineers of African American descent working in the industry at the time, and was known to be very skilled and creative in his approach to electronics design. Like in television, he created a gaming console that could be bought as a standalone unit, along with an expansion unit featuring keyboard and cassette deck that expanded it to a full computer. The first component, the MP1000 gaming console, was released in 1978. Uniquely, the MP1000 sported a Motorola 6800 CPU. It had 1 kilobyte of RAM and could do 8-color graphics at 128 by 192 resolution, or 256 by 192 at 4 colors. In most respects, it was pretty much like most other second-generation game consoles, with 2 ColecoVision-like controllers and a library that reached just over a dozen games. The base machine sold for about $130. APF produced their own software, probably their first mistake, and Smith was working overtime tweaking the hardware, testing games, and he even found himself doing sales for the machine. The Imagination Machine base unit was, like the Intellivision keyboard component, essentially a dock the MP1000 sat inside, connected electrically by its cartridge port. This expanded the MP1000 to 9 kilobytes of RAM and gave the user a keyboard as well as integrated cassette deck for storage, and came with a basic interpreter. The cassette deck was dual-sided and allowed the user to store not only programs but also audio, which was handy for making notations about the games they made. APF encouraged its user base to develop games for the system and maintained a mailing list to exchange games and ideas among their users. Critics praised the machine for its design and ease of use. So what went wrong? Well, a few things all at once. First, the Imagination Machine expansion unit arrived with its cassette-based storage just as Apple released the affordable Disc 2 drive. Second, APF's sales channels tended to be general consumer electronics stores, which knew little about computers and did not effectively market the machine, so sales never got much north of 20,000 units. Finally, the development of the Imagination Machine had cost $7 million borrowed dollars, and their bankers were not happy, suggesting APF go back to calculators. Anyway, APF didn't heed that advice and tried to refine the Imagination Machine by introducing a second version, this time with everything built into the case. Unfortunately, they only managed to get a few out before their financial clock finally ran out. This leaves the Imagination Machine as a very rare collectible, and one that can be very expensive since it appeals to 2 different and very well-moneyed groups of collectors, those into gaming consoles and those into vintage computers. That said, I've never seen one hit $13,000 like this one though. Yipes. This Imagination Machine came in its original box with packing foam, so that's kind of a bonus, I guess, though it's not really in the greatest of shape. And it does appear to work. Check out Blocky Balboa here. It would have been nice if the seller had, actually taken the machine out and shown it a bit more in pictures, but he seems to be really focused on the box for some reason. Here's a few random pics of other Imagination Machines just to give you a better sense of the device. Personally, I really don't understand eBay sellers who don't invest the effort to take decent quality pictures of the thing they're selling, especially when they seem to have some inkling that it's rare and valuable. According to Worthpoint, the more typical price for these machines is around $2,000 or less. There was even a brand new boxed unit that sold for $2,200 several years ago. So I am a little suspicious of this one. I always wonder with these if there's some kind of underworld type element happening. Sometimes prices seem to be a little too high too quickly, and I don't know. I've just always suspected that vintage computing might be one of those things that's occasionally used for money laundering. But in the absence of any proof of that, I have to assume this auction is legit. Maybe there's something in the pictures here that I'm not seeing that made this a must-have for someone. As someone who aspires to own one of these one day, I'm hoping this isn't one of the new insane benchmarks we've been seeing for certain rare vintage computers lately. Ooh, a mainframe. This one looks like it was from the 60s, but it's actually from the 1970s. The Universal Automatic Computer, aka UNIVAC, was first developed by the Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation. I hope I pronounced that right. They were based in Philadelphia. J. Presper Eckert and John Mauchly had built the famous ENIAC, a monster of a computer, at the University of Pennsylvania between 1943 and 1946. When their financier, Henry Strauss, died in a plane crash, the company was sold to Remington Rand, a typewriter manufacturer. The most famous UNIVAC product is probably the UNIVAC 1 mainframe, which correctly predicted the outcome of the 1952 presidential election. The UNIVAC Series 90 appears to have appeared in 1973 and were considered low-end. The 90/30 seems to have debuted in 1975 or thereabouts. The 90 series were replacements for the earlier UNIVAC 9000 series, which had an instruction set that was compatible with the IBM System 360. Some of them were adapted from machines from RCA's computing division, which was purchased by Sperry Rand in the mid-70s. Mainframes are not small. Check out this picture of a lady standing beside one sometime in the 70s. Yikes. Yeah, the shipping on this must have been huge. It's hard to deny the appeal of a mainframe front panel that features dials. This computer looks like it's ready to land astronauts on Mars. The 90/30 had 16 32-bit general registers with a second set of 16 for the operating system, which was called OS3. The 90/30 rented for $4,000 per month, or over $17,000 a month if fully expanded. Yikes. And I thought Microsoft licensing was ludicrously expensive. Of course, this thing was strictly for business and probably served out its life doing mundane tasks like keeping track of a client's insurance info, accounting, and so on. Maybe some enterprising IT person snuck a ported version of Zork in here, but I doubt it. There's no microprocessor on these. The CPU is implemented, I think, in TTL. I'm not familiar with most of the specs, but it mentions storage capacities of up to 262 kilobytes. Wow. Yeah, that'll keep ornery work geeks from storing on company equipment. This one appears to need a little work. Like, it's literally in pieces. Yeah, this is why I respect dudes like Usagi Electric. Guys that know how to actually repair this stuff. I mean, I'm struggling like crazy against this simple little Dynamicro from 1976 here. Just thinking about what would be involved to get this mess working again gives me hives. All these chips, yeah, reminds me of that 1974 terminal I am still working on. Yeah, I wouldn't have a prayer with something like this. This would become one of those things my wife would look at and be like, really? We need this? So how much does a broken up UNIVAC 90/30 go for in 2023? Oh, just 20 grand.
I'm gonna need more change.
20 grand for a busted old low-end mainframe. Yep, some people have money to burn and very understanding spouses. Although, when you think about it, adjusted for inflation, 20k is the equivalent of renting one of these for a couple months, so that's kind of a bargain. Like I said, Apple tends to dominate vintage computer values owing to the fact that it still exists as a multi-trillion-dollar company. I think had Steve Jobs not come back to mount a rescue in the mid-1990s, Apple would have died a pretty well-deserved death, and probably their most valuable memorabilia, the Apple I, the Lisa, etc., might not be quite as expensive as they are today. But yeah, that's not the particular thread of the multiverse that we live on. Ordinarily, a Lisa would top pretty much anything else sold on eBay in any particular year except an Apple I, or the final item on our top 10 list, which is also an Apple product. Drawing on the inspiration provided by the Xerox Alto, the Lisa on paper had it all. A GUI, Motorola 68000 CPU running at a blistering 5 MHz, 720 by 364 resolution graphics, preemptive multitasking, mouse, and an operating system that tried to mimic a real-life Office desktop. It was Steve Jobs' baby. Unfortunately, baby cost $10,000, and not even Jobs' considerable charms could sell that. Even for business, that was a big chunk of change for a largely proprietary and untested system. And that was before you got into the nightmare known as the Twiggy drive. These Apple-designed 5¼ floppy drives were a straight-up disaster. The Twiggy was supposed to do amazing things, quadrupling the amount of data that could be stored on a disk by doubling the data rate, motor speed control, and so on. But it turned out to be a bit too ambitious a project for young Apple, and the drives quickly developed a reputation for being unreliable. With sales tanking, Apple scrambled to make improvements. First to go were the Twiggy drives, a decision that would have monumental implications for future collectors. Apple offered upgrades to convert Lisas into Lisa 2s, which pulled out the Twiggies and replaced them with the first 3.5-inch floppy drive designed by Sony. They also began selling Lisa 2s that were built as such from day one. This did absolutely nothing to help matters though, and Apple eventually decided to cut their losses, burying thousands of Lisa 2s in a landfill in Logan, Utah, where their shattered pieces await archaeologists' scraping tools. Not all unsold Lisas were scrapped though. A bunch were resold via a company called Sun Remarketing. But the fact is, they are very rare today, and the original Twiggy drive model even more so. In fact, not that long ago, a set of Twiggy drives sold for $20,000 all by their damn selves. Sheesh. This Lisa, however, didn't even reach half the usual going rate for a Lisa 1. Why? Simple, no Twiggy drives. Like many Lisa 1s, this unit was upgraded to Lisa 2 specs at some point. But you can still reverse the process, of course, if you can find the parts. In this case, the seller has a reproduction Lisa 1 front panel installed and is calling this machine a Lisa 1. Of course, absent the Twiggies, it's simply not worth the usual $55,000 Lisas usually fetch. I mean, it looks really good, whoever did the repro panels went all out, but sadly, like most former Lisa 1s, this machine will likely never be whole again. It's still got 22 grand though.
You're not alright, are you?
Well, I told you Apple ruled the vintage computing collectibles roost, didn't I? This year's champion, the most expensive computer thing sold in 2023, is an Apple Penlight tablet from 1992. The idea of a flat digital device one could write on goes back a lot further than you might think. Conceptually, the tablet computer is thought to have been first described by Alan Kay in 1972. An American computer scientist, Kay described a device that he called the Dynabook, which was designed for children as an educational aid. The quote-unquote tablet was a lot like a later TRS-80 Model 100, but with a larger screen and the addition of a stylus with the ability to draw directly on it. The Dynabook was never actually realized though due to the limits of technology at the time. During the 1980s, there were various attempts to make the concept real, including machines like the rather large and unwieldy Linus Wright-Top. The first successful tablet is probably the GridPad by Grid Systems, which managed to significantly cut down size and weight, but I don't think it had the ability to operate by the touch of a finger. The designer of the GridPad, by the way, Jeff Hawkins, went on to found another company you may have heard of, Palm. Anyway, in the early 1990s, tablets were becoming all the rage, and Apple wanted a piece of that action, thus the Penlight project, also known by its codename Scribe, led by Tom Gilly. The Penlight was basically a reworked Powerbook Duo 210 featuring 25MHz Motorola's 68030 processor, 4 to 24MB of RAM, 120MB hard drive, and apart from the tablet form factor, was otherwise compatible with existing Apple peripherals. It looked a bit like a laptop with the screen installed backwards, weighed about 4 pounds or 4 times heavier than the current iPad, and relied on a stylus for input using an OS extension called PenMac. The screen was one of those awful backlit LCDs, and you can see this one due to age, unfortunately it started to leak. The Penlight sadly never made it to market. Apple felt that it would cannibalize sales from the disastrously unsuccessful Newton. Part of the problem was, lacking a touchscreen keyboard like tablets do now, input was a bit tricky and required some training for the device to recognize what you were trying to do. And the technology was a little bit inconsistent at best. Some companies like Palm developed their own handwriting system to ease recognition, but it was clunky and far from 100% accurate. So it's probably best that the Penlight never actually got out there. Most of the technology was reallocated, licensed, or sold, but one direct descendant of the Penlight was the Freestyle tablet by Assistive Technology. Most of the Apple prototypes I've seen over the years, including the clear case Compact Max, usually look pretty close to the final product, albeit a little bit rougher, if that's the word. Not all prototypes by all manufacturers make it obvious that they're prototypes, but Apple makes this one pretty obvious with their labeling on the bottom here. I think this is a makeshift serial number, and if it's to be believed, perhaps 100 or so of these prototypes were ever made, so 30 plus years later, to put it mildly, yeah, they're pretty rare. Prototype computers of any brand almost always fetch a premium on eBay, and especially if they wear the famed Bitten Apple logo. So how much did our most expensive vintage computer item of 2023 go for? A cool $25,000 US.
Bruh. Nah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not that hot to trot for something like this. Prototypes aren't something you want to play around with too much. Software can be limited to non-existent. They can be very fragile, and once something breaks, good luck fixing it. The screen on this one is particularly concerning. Once LCD screens start leaking, they tend to just keep getting worse. Anyway, I don't have $25K lying around, so this is someone else's problem to worry about. Anyway, that's the top 10 for 2023, folks. So what does that mean for the hobby of collecting vintage computers? Okay, if you're like a lot of vintage computing enthusiasts, you're probably clenching your teeth a little bit about the 5-figure prices here. And to be fair, yeah, seeing those kind of numbers does kind of suck the fun out of the hobby a little bit. And I feel that way too sometimes, especially living in a world of $1,700 vintage keyboards, which were separated from their original terminals. Yeah, that really sucks. And of course, it's never fun to be outbid by hundreds of dollars on things you think should be cheap, like this 386 12MHz CPU that nearly went for a couple grand. Even machines that don't touch 4 figures often seem stupidly expensive for what they are, like this Quest Super Elf, which goes for hundreds of dollars. Yet all is not as bad as it seems. While there are certainly outliers, there's still quite a lot of affordable stuff out there. Like I said, I wouldn't pay more than $75 for a decent Apple IIe. There are 4 million made, and more keep coming out of the woodwork every day. Same with Tandy, Commodore 64, and so on. And even among the really expensive stuff, deals do sometimes pop up. Sometimes sellers will post something really rare like a TI 99/4 for $30 when it's worth more than 10 times that amount. You just gotta be dedicated and very patient. On that note, that's it for this video, and if you've made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Every view is appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, please smack that like button. If not, beat that dislike button.
Excuse me?
If you really enjoy Tech Time Traveler videos, please do consider subscribing or even joining my small but dedicated army of patrons who help make these videos possible. Thanks again, and we'll see you very soon.